The morning my father called to tell me I was fired from my own company, I was sitting in the parking garage of that building, on the 4th floor, in the spot with my name stenciled in white paint on the concrete. I had been there since 6:47 a.m. Not because I had an early meeting. Because I always arrived first. That was the thing about building something from nothing, you never quite lose the habit of being the first one through the door, even 7 years later, even when the company employs 214 people and occupies 3 floors of glass in downtown Austin. He called at 7:03 a.m. His voice had that particular quality it always carried when he believed he had already won something. Measured. Unhurried. The way a man speaks when he has rehearsed both sides of a conversation and decided in advance how it ends. There's going to be a board meeting this afternoon. An emergency session. It's been called to address some leadership concerns. He paused just long enough to let the word emergency land. I think you know what this means, Maya. I sat in the driver's seat with my keys still in my hand, engine off, watching the lobby security feed on my phone. My employees were arriving through the glass doors 4 floors below. People I had hired. People I had fought for. People whose names and children's names and 2-year plans I knew by heart. I know exactly what it means, I said. What my father did not know was that I had known for 11 days. If you're new here and this story is already sitting somewhere familiar in your chest, hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, I read every single one. Now let me take you back. Because to understand what happened in that boardroom, you need to understand what it took to build the room itself. I founded Carepath Technologies in the spring 7 years ago, when I was 26 years old, with $23,000 in personal savings, a rented desk at a co-working space on South Congress Avenue, and a problem I had been turning over in my mind since my first week working at a hospital in Dallas. I had spent 2 years after college as a patient advocate at a large regional health system. Every day I watched the same thing unfold, patients discharged with 3 different sets of instructions from 3 different departments, none of which communicated with each other, none of which knew what the others had told the patient. Families calling the wrong numbers. Medications overlapping. People falling through gaps that should never have existed. A 71-year-old man readmitted 4 days after discharge because his home health nurse hadn't received his discharge summary. A mother of 2 who couldn't figure out which of her 5 post-surgical instructions was the most recent. Small failures that compounded into large, preventable crises. I built a software platform to close those gaps. A care coordination system that let hospitals, specialists, home health agencies, and patients all access the same real-time information from a single dashboard. It took 14 months to build the first viable version. I lived on protein bars and coffee, slept 4 hours on most nights, and maxed out a credit card twice. In November of that first year, during the second credit card crisis, I called my mother just to hear a familiar voice. She told me I should probably think about getting a real job before I did any more damage to my credit score. My father's response, when I described what I was building at a family dinner in San Antonio, was a single sentence delivered while he cut his steak. Tech is a man's game, Maya. I'd hate to watch you learn that the hard way. I drove home that night with both hands on the wheel and something crystallizing in my chest that I did not yet have a name for. Not doubt. Not defeat. Something colder and more durable than either of those. The quiet certainty that when this worked, not if, when, he was going to have to say something about it. I just did not know what form that something would eventually take. Carepath launched in beta to its first hospital client 15 months after I started. A regional medical center in San Marcos. 43 beds. A director of nursing named Sandra Okafor who had been fighting the same coordination failures I had identified and who agreed to pilot the platform at a deeply discounted first-year rate in exchange for my personal guarantee that I would fix every reported bug within 24 hours. I fixed 41 bugs in the first 6 weeks. I kept that promise every single time. At the end of the pilot, Sandra Okafor sent me a 1-paragraph email. The last line read, "Whatever you need to grow this, I will help you get it." That email opened my first real investor conversation. Which brings me to my father. 6 months into Carepath's first paid contract year, revenue was $310,000. Real revenue. Signed contracts, invoices paid on schedule. I was in early conversations with 3 venture firms and needed a bridge to get the company to a place where those conversations could close. My father called me on a Wednesday. He said he wanted to invest $200,000 in exchange for 15% equity and a seat on the board of directors. I said yes. I know what you are thinking. I was thinking it too, somewhere underneath the relief of a funding problem being partially resolved. But he was my father. I was 27. And the combination of those 2 facts made me want to believe that his interest in the company was also, in some translation I was too hopeful to question, interest in me. That the check was a form of pride he did not know how to say out loud. I signed the papers in April. By the following July, Carepath had 6 hospital clients and $1.2 million in annual recurring revenue. My father attended his first board meeting and spent 45 minutes asking questions I could tell he had prepared from a technology magazine. He did not know the product. He did not know the clients. But he moved to the chair at the head of the conference table, not the one I had gestured him toward, and he spoke with the unhurried authority of a man who believed his check had also purchased the room's deference. I let it go. There were 4 other board members at that table. People I had chosen with care, a healthcare operations veteran named Carla Dempsey, a technology investor named James Obey, a former hospital system CIO named Dr. Lin, and a governance attorney named Torres who had helped me structure the company's bylaws from the beginning. They knew what they were looking at. They knew who had built what was in front of them. I told myself my father's posturing was harmless. It was the kind of thing I had grown up learning to absorb. I was wrong about the harmless part. The first real signal came 18 months after he joined the board. My brother Daniel called me on a Sunday afternoon. Daniel is 2 years older than me. He is charming the way a freshly painted surface is charming, it reads as smooth until you press on it and feel what is underneath. He had spent a decade moving between sales roles at 3 different companies, each position louder and shorter-lived than the one before. He had a talent for walking into rooms and generating enthusiasm for about 6 months, and a corresponding talent for moving on before the results arrived. "I've been thinking," he said. "I want to come work at Carepath." I knew before the sentence ended that this had not originated with Daniel. Dad suggested it, didn't he? It was not a question. A beat of silence. He thinks it would be good for the company. I've got real sales experience, Maya. His sales experience was 10 years of quotas he had approached but never quite reached, and the particular warmth of a man who makes promises that outlast his employment. I knew this. My father knew this too. What my father also understood was that putting Daniel inside the company gave him a second pair of eyes on operations, a second voice in internal conversations, and a plausible reason to be more deeply involved without appearing to overstep. I said no that Sunday. My father called me the following Thursday. He did not mention Daniel directly. He talked about Q3 projections, a partnership I was exploring, new product features my engineering team was developing. Normal board member topics, handled in a normal board member tone. At the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, he said, Daniel would really benefit from somewhere stable. Something to anchor him. I said nothing. 4 seconds of silence. He is your brother, my father added. And I heard underneath those words what he meant, he is my son. And this company is, at least in part, mine. I brought Daniel on as Vice President of Sales Operations 8 weeks later. I was deliberate about the title. Not VP of Sales, Sales Operations. A distinction that placed him in an internal process role rather than a client-facing one, reporting to our sales director, not to me directly. I set measurable deliverables. I documented the scope in writing. I told myself I had managed the exposure. I had not managed the exposure. Daniel was effective at the parts of the job that people could see. He was present at every meeting. He learned client names quickly and used them with a warmth that read as genuine. He charmed 2 investors at our Series B closed dinner with the ease that I had spent 7 years cultivating, and he deployed in a single evening over dessert. My father began citing him in board discussions. Daniel flagged an efficiency gap in the onboarding flow. Daniel raised some morale observations from the sales team. Not once did my father say, "Maya flagged this. Maya observed that." Even when the information had originated with me, which it frequently did, often in conversations Daniel had been present for, it arrived at the board table wearing his name. I documented every instance. The date, the meeting, the exact language used. I kept the file on my personal drive, not the company server, in a folder I labeled simply, Pattern. I did not yet know what I would do with it. I only knew I needed to be able to see it clearly on the days when I could no longer fully trust my own perception of what was happening. That is the particular cruelty of being undermined by someone who is supposed to love you. It happens gradually enough that you keep second-guessing yourself. You think, maybe I am reading too much into it. Maybe we have always had friction and I am projecting it onto neutral moments. Maybe he is just difficult in the way fathers and daughters are sometimes difficult, and I am making it into something it isn't. I thought all of those things. I also kept the document, and I kept it current, because the part of me that had built a company from $23,000 and 41 bugs and a promise kept 41 times knew the difference between friction and strategy. And what I was watching was strategy. 2 years after Daniel joined, Carepath had grown to $31 million in annual revenue, 147 employees, and 4 new enterprise hospital contracts. I had been named to a regional healthcare innovation list. 2 board members had submitted my name for a national industry recognition. And my father, at Christmas dinner at my parents' house in San Antonio, told my uncle sitting across the table that the company is really hitting its stride now that the team has matured. My uncle looked at me. "Isn't Maya the one running it?" My father smiled. "She's the founder, of course. But it takes more than a founder to build a real business." My mother was cutting her ham. She did not look up. I put my fork down. I looked at my plate for 3 seconds. Then I picked my fork back up and kept eating, because I had learned 20 years before that Christmas table that reacting gave my father exactly what he was looking for. 20 minutes later I excused myself and stood at the bathroom sink with the water running and said to my own reflection, quietly, so the words only lived between me and the mirror, "You built that company. You built every square foot of it. And he knows that. That's the entire point." When I came back to the table the conversation had moved on. My mother was describing Daniel's new apartment. How nicely it had come together. How much he had grown. I finished my dinner. I drove home at 9 o'clock. I opened my laptop and added 3 lines to the document labeled Pattern. 3 years ago I began laying the groundwork for a Series C. Carepath was ready to scale nationally. We had proof of concept across 12 states, a product architecture that could support 10 times our current client volume, and a revenue base that made us a legitimate conversation for growth equity. I was talking informally to 2 firms, Apex Partners and Greenfield Capital. The conversations were early but substantive. I was being careful about timing because I had learned that the wrong capital partner at the wrong moment could complicate the governance structure I had spent 7 years protecting. I needed a round that did not hand any new single investor enough leverage to shift the board dynamics I had built. My father found out about those conversations before I was ready to bring them to the board formally. I still do not know exactly how. My clearest guess is Daniel, who had been present in 2 planning discussions with my head of finance and would have understood enough of the context to pass it along without fully grasping what he was handing over. My father called me on a Friday morning. He did not ask about the conversations. He stated them. "I understand you've been in discussions with Apex Partners and Greenfield Capital." I confirmed it. Without informing the board. The conversations aren't at a stage that requires board notification under the governance framework we agreed to at formation. Silence. I'm a board member, Maya. I expect to be kept informed. You'll be informed when there's something to inform you of. That's how this process works. He hung up without saying goodbye. That was new. He had always been careful about maintaining the surface of a reasonable disagreement. The abrupt hang-up told me the surface was becoming harder to hold. At the next board meeting, 6 weeks later, I presented the Series C proposal. A clean deck with strong underlying data, detailed term sheet comparisons, and a 12-month deployment plan. Carla Dempsey and James Obey had previewed it. Dr. Lin had good questions, the kind generated by someone who had read carefully. My father waited for me to finish. Then he said, "Before we move forward on any capital raise, I'd like to discuss leadership structure." I set my pen on the table. Carla Dempsey straightened in her chair. James Obey looked at my father with an expression I had learned to read over 4 years of working together. It was the expression of a man who had already heard this particular argument and had already made up his mind about it. "What specifically would you like to discuss?" Torres asked. "Whether this company is being led in the right direction at the executive level." He said it while looking at James Obey. Not at me. At the person he most needed to convince. Carla Dempsey did not wait. "Richard, Carepath posted 43% revenue growth last quarter. What exactly is your concern with leadership direction?" My father smiled. The kind of smile that does not include the eyes. "There are operational gaps that a stronger executive configuration could address. I've had some conversations with members of the management team, and I've heard concerns about culture and decision-making velocity." Culture and decision-making velocity. I recognized those words. They were not his. He had not used that kind of language in 7 years of board meetings. Someone had given them to him. And the person who had been spending the most time in my father's ear, who had also been having conversations with my management team without my knowledge, was sitting in his apartment that Richard Caldwell had told my mother was so nicely put together. I tabled the Series C discussion. Not because my father's concerns held any substance. Because I needed to understand what was already in motion before I could afford to be distracted by what was visible. I drove home that evening and sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours. Not panicking. Mapping. Who Daniel had spoken to. What shape those conversations might have taken. Whether anyone on my management team had said something to me, or had conspicuously not said something to me. I called Carla Dempsey at 9 o'clock. She had been waiting. She told me that Richard had approached James Obey separately in the 2 weeks before the meeting. She did not know exactly what had been said, but she knew James's response had not been what Richard was hoping for. She told me Torres was clean, he had been my governance advisor from the beginning and had no reason to change sides now. That gave me 4 of 7 board seats I was confident in. My father held one. He had brought in the remaining 2 during the Series B close, 18 months earlier, a compromise I had accepted in order to close the round on schedule when the timing was urgent. Their names were Holt and Briggs. I did not yet know what they had agreed to, or whether they had agreed to anything at all. I found out 11 days before my father's phone call, when a former colleague who worked in venture legal told me over coffee that he had heard, through a chain he declined to trace specifically, that there were whispers of an emergency governance review at a mid-sized Austin health tech company with a Series C pending. He looked at me steadily across his coffee cup. "I don't know if it's your company," he said. "But if it were mine, I'd want to know who was already standing with me before anyone called a meeting." I drove back to the office. I called an off-calendar meeting with Carla, James Obey, Dr. Lin, and Torres that same afternoon. Not in the main conference room. In the smaller boardroom on the 2nd floor, the one with no sight lines to the open floor plan below. I told them what I had heard. Carla already suspected. James Obey confirmed that Richard had explicitly suggested the board might want to consider a transitional leadership structure ahead of the capital raise, to give incoming investors confidence in management continuity. He had declined. Dr. Lin had received a similar approach. She had also declined. Torres told me that an emergency session called without proper procedural grounds would be challengeable under the company's own governance documents he had written. Then he slid a folder across the table. Inside was a written board resolution, signed by 5 of the 7 members, affirming full confidence in my leadership and authorizing the continuation of Series C conversations. My father and his 2 allies did not know it existed. It had been prepared quietly over 11 days while my father was assembling what he believed was a winning position. I looked at the 5 signatures on that page. I thought about the $23,000. The protein bars. The 41 bugs. I thought about Sandra Okafor's last line, "Whatever you need to grow this." I thought about my father at my family's Christmas table explaining that it takes more than a founder to build a real business, while my mother kept her eyes on her plate. I closed the folder. Placed both hands flat on the table. The board meeting my father had called was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon. I had been in my parking spot since 6:47 a.m. And when his call came in at 7:03, I already knew how the day would end. The only thing left was to let him say what he had come to say. After I hung up, I sat in my car for 4 more minutes. Not because I needed time to compose myself. I had been composed for 11 days, ever since the folder landed across the table in the second-floor boardroom, and I understood that the people I had built this company with had not waited for me to ask for their loyalty. They had already given it, quietly and in writing, before I had even confirmed what was coming. I sat there for 4 minutes because I wanted to feel the weight of what was about to happen before I walked into the building. My father had spent 3 years building toward this morning. He had used his board seat, his check, my brother, and the leverage of a family name I had grown up inside, and he had done it all with the patience of a man who had never once doubted that what he had funded was also his to control. He was wrong. But I wanted to know the full shape of that wrongness before I walked through the door, because once I walked through, there would be no more waiting. I got out of the car at 7:11 a.m. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor. I said good morning to 4 people on the way to my office. I used their names. I meant it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. At 8:30, Carla Dempsey knocked on my open office door. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee from the cart on the 2nd floor, the one I had set up 3 years ago because I had noticed that the team was spending 12 minutes every morning walking to the nearest cafe, and I did not want them spending 12 minutes of their mornings walking anywhere but toward the work they loved. She set 1 cup on my desk and sat down across from me without being asked. "Holt called me last night," she said. "After your father called him." I wrapped both hands around the cup. "And?" "He said he wasn't comfortable with the process. He said he'd agreed to raise leadership concerns at the meeting but that nobody mentioned removing you from the CEO role. He thought it was a performance review conversation." I looked at her. "He didn't know it was a termination vote." "He says he didn't." I believe him. That was significant. Holt was one of my father's 2 allies on the board. If Holt had been misled about what he was participating in, then my father had not assembled a coalition. He had assembled 2 people who thought they were attending one meeting while he was planning a different one entirely. "What about Briggs?" Carla shook her head once. "Briggs is Richards," she said. "He's been Richards for a while." I nodded. I had suspected Briggs for longer than I had allowed myself to say out loud. He had joined the board during the Series B as a condition of a co-investment my father had orchestrated, and for 18 months he had been reliably present, reliably agreeable, and reliably positioned just to my father's left at every meeting. "So he goes in today with 1, I said. Carla smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who had spent 30 years in healthcare operations and had stopped being surprised by men who mistake funding for ownership. "He goes in today with 1, she confirmed. She stood up, picked up her coffee. "I'll see you at 2 o'clock. She walked out, and I turned back to my window, And I looked at Austin in the morning and I thought about Sandra Okafor's email and the 41 bugs and the $23,000, and I felt something settle in my chest that had not been settled in 3 years. Not triumph. Readiness. My brother arrived at the building at 1:15 p.m. I know because I watched the lobby feed on my phone. He was not on the board. He had no official role in a board session. He walked in wearing a charcoal suit I had never seen before, which told me he had purchased it for this occasion, which told me he had known for longer than he had let on that this day was coming and had decided in advance what he wanted to look like when it arrived. He took the elevator to the 4th floor, where the main conference room was. He did not stop at his office first. He went straight to the room. My father was already there. I know because Torres texted me at 1:22 p.m. 3 words, Richard is early. I typed back, I know. I stayed in my office until 1:51 p.m. Then I picked up the folder Torres had given me, the one with the signed resolution inside, and I walked down the hall. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows on the south wall. I had chosen this building partly because of that glass, because I had spent 2 years in a co-working space with no natural light and I had promised myself that when I had my own building I would put windows everywhere so that the people inside it never forgot they were connected to something outside themselves. The afternoon sun came through those windows at an angle that turned the table a warm gold. I noticed it when I walked in because I always noticed it. 14 people were in the room. 7 board members, an assistant my father had brought without clearing it with anyone, 3 people from my legal and finance teams who had been notified of the emergency session and had a right to attend, and my brother, who had none. I sat at my usual place. Not the head. The seat I had always used, 2 positions from the end, which put me in the center of the room's sightline and gave me a clear view of every face at the table simultaneously. It was where I always sat. My father sat at the head. He had arranged the seating in advance. I could tell because the placards that my assistant usually placed in a standard rotation had been repositioned. Daniel was sitting to my father's right, in a chair that had no placard at all, which meant it had been added to the table after the room was set. Torres caught my eye from across the table. He did not smile. He did not need to. My father opened the meeting at exactly 2 o'clock. He had a prepared statement. I know because he read from it, and my father does not read from documents in board meetings. He speaks off the cuff because he believes it makes him look authoritative, which it does, which is why what I was watching, him reading, carefully, from a printed page, told me that someone else had written what he was about to say, and that he did not trust himself to keep the words straight without the paper in front of him. I've called this emergency session, he began, because I believe Carepath Technologies is at a critical inflection point, and that the leadership configuration that got us here is not the one that will take us where we need to go. He paused. He looked up from the page. He looked at Holt first, then at Briggs, confirming that his 2 votes were in their seats. I am formally proposing that the board vote to transition the Chief Executive Officer role to an interim leader while we conduct a comprehensive executive search ahead of the Series C close. I am further proposing that Daniel Caldwell serve as that interim CEO, effective immediately, given his operational familiarity with the company and his relationship with the leadership team. The room was very quiet. My father set his paper down. He straightened his jacket. He had the look of a man who has just delivered a speech he has been composing for months and is now waiting to receive what he believes is coming. He had not looked at me once since I entered the room. I sat with both hands flat on the table and I did not move. Carla Dempsey was looking at her coffee cup. James Obie was looking at the window. Dr. Lynn had her hands folded on the table in front of her. Torres was looking at me. Holt, to my father's left, had an expression I recognized from my years in hospitals. It was the expression of a person who has just realized that the procedure being described is not the one they consented to. His eyes moved from my father to me and back again, and I watched him understand, in real time, that he had been brought into this room under a different set of terms than the ones currently on the table. My father said, "I'd like to call the vote." Torres said, Before we do that, I need to raise a procedural point. My father turned to him. He was still holding his posture carefully, the posture of a man who has accounted for every variable. The board received notice of this session 18 hours ago, Torres continued. Under Article 7 of the governance framework, a vote to remove or transition the chief executive officer requires 14 days written notice to all board members, with the specific nature of the vote disclosed in that notice. This notice cited general leadership concerns. It did not disclose that the vote would be for CEO removal. Holt looked up sharply. It didn't? No, Torres said. It did not. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Holt looked at my father. Richard, I thought we were here to discuss a performance framework. My father's jaw tightened. This is a leadership transition, not a removal. The language is important. The governance framework doesn't make that distinction, Torres said. A vote affecting the CEO's continued tenure in any capacity requires full disclosure and proper notice. This vote, as proposed, is procedurally invalid. My father set both hands flat on the table. Torres, you work for this company, not for Maya personally. I work for the board of this company, Torres said. And I have an obligation to every member of that board to ensure that the process we follow is the one we agreed to at formation. That is my only obligation in this room. Silence. My father looked at Briggs. Briggs was studying his notepad. He did not look up. That was when my father turned to me for the first time since I had entered the room. His expression had shifted. Not from certainty to doubt, that would come later. From certainty to the first edge of something he had not planned for. I opened the folder. I slid the document across the table to Torres, who passed it to Dr. Lin, who passed it along the full length of the table so that every person in the room could see it moving before anyone had read a word. When it reached Holt, he picked it up. He read it for 10 seconds. His face changed. He set it back down. This is a board resolution, he said. Already signed. By 5 members, Torres confirmed. Executed 11 days ago. It affirms full confidence in Maya Caldwell's leadership as Chief Executive Officer and authorizes the continuation of Series C conversations under her direction. It was prepared and circulated privately after credible information suggested an attempt to call an emergency governance vote without proper procedural grounds. My father stared at the document. His hands, which had been flat on the table, curled slowly. Daniel, beside him, had stopped performing the expression of measured professional interest he had been wearing since the meeting opened. He was looking at the resolution the way a person looks at something that has rearranged the furniture of a room they thought they knew. My father said, very quietly, you had 5 members sign a document in secret. I looked at him. I let the silence sit for one full breath before I spoke. 5-2, Dad. 11 days ago. 10 words. 11 days ago. The document had been signed before he had even made his phone call. He had walked into this room this afternoon believing he was closing something he had already opened. What he had walked into was a room that had already answered his question before he had finished asking it. The silence that followed those 10 words was the most complete silence I have ever heard in a room containing 14 people. Holt exhaled slowly through his nose. Dr. Lin looked at her hands. James Obie looked at the window again, and this time I understood that he was looking at it because he did not want my father to see his expression. Briggs was still studying his notepad. He had not spoken once. My father said, "This is a manipulation of the governance process." "No," Torres said. "This is the governance process. A written resolution signed by a majority of the board is binding under the company's own bylaws. The resolution you're looking at supersedes any vote attempted today on the same subject matter. I want legal counsel present. You're welcome to arrange that. The resolution remains in effect while you do." My father looked at Daniel. For a single moment, the careful management he had been doing of his own expression slipped, and what I saw underneath it was something I had not expected, not anger, not calculation, but a kind of bewilderment that told me he had genuinely believed, until 30 seconds ago, that this was going to work. That the check and the board seat and the 3 years and the brother he had placed inside my company like a slow-moving clause in a contract had built him something he could finally collect on. He had believed it completely. And in the believing of it he had never seriously considered that the people I had built this company alongside might love it the same way I did, and might have spent 11 days protecting it the same way I had spent 7 years building it. I gathered my folder. I looked around the table at Carla, at James, at Dr. Lin, at Torres, at Holt, who was still looking at the resolution with the expression of a man accounting for what he had almost agreed to, and I said, "If there's no further business requiring my presence, I have a company to run." I walked out. The door closed behind me. I did not hear a word from inside that room for the remaining 19 minutes the meeting lasted. Carla found me in my office at 3:47 p.m. "He's gone," she said. "Daniel left at 3. Your father stayed another 20 minutes but there was nothing left to discuss. Torres is writing up the formal record of the session." I nodded. I was looking at my laptop screen. I had been answering emails for the last hour and 40 minutes with a focus I had not felt in 3 years, the particular clarity that comes when something that has been pressing on you from a direction you can't quite name finally resolves itself into a shape you can see and address directly. "Holt called Torres privately before he left," Carla said. "He wants to formally register that he was not informed of the nature of the vote before he agreed to attend. He wants it in the record." "That's fair." "He also asked if you'd be willing to speak with him." I thought about Holt. He was not an ally, not in the way Carla and James and Dr. Lin were allies. But he was not my father's instrument either, not wittingly, which was a meaningful distinction. "Yes," I said. "Schedule it." My mother called at 6:15 that evening. I was still at the office. I knew she would call because she always called after my father had been somewhere difficult and needed a secondary version of events delivered by a voice he trusted more than his own. She was not calling to ask how I was. She was calling to tell me how he was. "Your father is devastated, Maya." I did not say anything. He was trying to protect the company. He's worried about the Series C. He's worried about your leadership bandwidth given everything you've been managing. He only ever wanted what was best. He only ever wanted what was best. I looked at the Austin skyline through my office window. The sky was going orange and pink at the edges the way it does on evenings in July when the day has been very long and the heat has finally decided to release its grip. "He brought Daniel to the board meeting," I said. "Daniel isn't a board member. He just wanted support. Mom, he attempted to have me removed as CEO of a company I built from $23,000 and replace me with a man who has never hit a sales quota in 10 years of trying. That is what happened this afternoon. I need you to know that I know that." Clearly and without revision. Silence on her end. I heard a kitchen drawer open and close. I had been listening to that sound my whole life, the particular slide and catch of the drawer where she kept the dish towels, the one she opens and closes when she is on the phone and doesn't know what to do with her hands. "He invested in you," she finally said. "Yes," I said. $200,000 for 15% of a company that is currently valued at $87 million. He has made approximately $13 million on that investment. I have not asked him for anything back. I only ever asked him to let me run what I built." Another silence. Longer this time. "He's still your father." "I know that," I said. "That's the part that makes it hard. Good night, Mom." I hung up. I sat at my desk until 8 o'clock. Then I turned off the lights and drove home, and I slept for 7 hours straight, which was the longest I had slept in 11 days. In the 48 hours that followed, the consequences moved faster than I had expected and with less noise. My father did not contest the resolution formally. Torres told me he had consulted an outside attorney, who had confirmed what Torres already knew. The pre-signed resolution was valid, the attempted vote had been procedurally defective, and any challenge would require my father to publicly disclose the nature of what he had tried to do in a room full of witnesses, several of whom had already begun revising their understanding of the afternoon's events. He did not pursue it. Daniel submitted his resignation from his vice president of sales operations role 4 days after the meeting. The email he sent was 3 sentences long. It cited a desire to explore other opportunities. He did not copy me on it. It came to me through HR, which was how I had asked for all of his correspondence to be routed from the day he joined, a habit I had established quietly and which he had never noticed. I read the 3 sentences once. I forwarded it to my HR director with a single instruction: process per standard terms. I did not respond to Daniel directly. There was nothing I needed to say to him that had not already been said by 5 signatures on a document he never knew existed until it was too late to matter. The call I had not expected came from James Obie, on the evening of the 3rd day after the meeting. He did not call to debrief the boardroom or to discuss my father's next move. He called to tell me that Apex Partners had reached out to him independently, inquiring about Carepath's leadership stability ahead of a potential term sheet. Someone had apparently been speaking to them about concerns at the executive level. Someone who was not me and who was not on my team. James had told them, "The board has voted its confidence in the current CEO, the governance structure is sound, and the company is ready to move forward with the raise." The Apex Partners representative had thanked him and said they were still very interested. I held the phone for a moment after James and I finished talking. My father had gone outside the board, outside the company, and tried to use the Series C conversations themselves as a mechanism to make me look unstable. He had tried to poison the well of my own capital raise. And James Obie, who had been sitting at my board table for 4 years, who had watched me build something from a single hospital client to $87 million in valuation, had shut the door on that attempt so quietly and so completely that I almost hadn't noticed it happening. I called Carla next. I told her what James had said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what the difference is between you and your father, Maya?" I waited. "You built something real. Real things have people who protect them." He never understood that the company was never really his to take, because you never built it for him. I sat with that sentence for a long time after I hung up. Not because it surprised me. Because it was the first time someone outside of me had said plainly the thing I had known and been unable to name for 3 years. The company had never been his. Not the one I had built. He had purchased a percentage. He had never purchased the thing itself. The Series C closed 4 months after the board meeting. $62 million. Apex Partners led the round. At the signing dinner, their managing partner told me that the stability and unanimity of my board had been one of the deciding factors in their confidence. He said it plainly, over dinner, in a room full of people who had worked to make it happen. I thanked him. I did not tell him the full story of what that unanimity had required. Some things you carry quietly, not because you are ashamed of them, but because the people in the room who matter already know, and the ones who don't already know don't need to. Carepath Technologies today employs 341 people. We operate across 22 states. Sandra Okafor, the director of nursing from the San Marcos Hospital who took a chance on a beta platform and a 26-year-old with a promise to fix every bug in 24 hours, is now on our customer advisory board. She flew in for our Series C close celebration and sat at the head of the client table and told the room that the first time she met me I had shown up at her hospital with a laptop and a legal pad and had not left until every question she had was answered. I did not know she was going to say that. I had to look at the ceiling for a moment to collect myself, which is not something I typically do in professional settings, but which felt, in that moment, entirely appropriate. My father still holds his 15%. He has not attended a board meeting since July. He has not been removed, because removal was never the point. The point was never to take something from him. The point was to make clear that what he had tried to take from me had never been available. Torres told me, 6 weeks after the meeting, that Richard had quietly retained outside counsel and then quietly released them, which told me that whatever case he had thought he could make had not survived the first conversation with someone who understood governance documents. He has not called me. I have not called him. I do not know yet what we are to each other now, or whether we will find our way to something that can honestly be called a relationship again. I know that I am not the one who has to decide that first. I know what I built, and I know what he tried to do to it, and I know that those two things will have to be accounted for before anything else between us can be real. I am willing to wait for that accounting. I have learned, over 7 years of building something from nothing, that the most important things rarely arrive on anyone's preferred schedule. My mother calls on Sundays now. Not every Sunday, but most of them. The calls are careful the way early conversations between people learning a new language are careful, deliberate, slightly slower than natural, with pauses where one of us is searching for the right word rather than the convenient one. She has not apologized directly for standing in the margin of what my father attempted. I think she is still arriving at an understanding of what her silence has cost over the years, and I have decided to give her the time to complete that journey rather than meet her halfway through it and tell her what she should already know. That is a different kind of patience than the patience I used at the board table. That kind has grief in it. I will not pretend otherwise. Daniel and I have not spoken. I heard through my mother that he took a sales role at a logistics company in Houston. I hope it is the one that finally fits. I mean that without irony and without warmth. I simply mean it as a neutral, honest wish for a person I share blood with and have otherwise run out of road with, at least for now. The door is not locked. I have just stopped standing in front of it waiting for him to knock. There is something I need to tell you about the night after the board meeting. Not the part about my father, not the part about the resolution or the 5 signatures or the 10 words that ended the afternoon. The part that happened after I drove home and turned off the lights and sat in my kitchen alone for 20 minutes before I went to bed. I sat there and I thought about the $200,000. Not with anger. With something more complicated than anger. Because here is the truth about that money, it was real. It came at a moment when I needed it and it helped me build something that is now worth 400 times what he put in. And the fact that he later tried to use that investment as a lever to take from me what it had helped create does not entirely erase the moment in which it arrived, because nothing is entirely one thing when it involves a parent. I know that. I have always known that. What I also know is that gratitude for what someone gave you at one moment does not obligate you to accept what they try to take at another. Those are two separate ledgers. I have learned to keep them that way. I have been asked, more than once since that afternoon, whether I would do anything differently. Whether there was a version of the last 7 years in which I saw the shape of what was coming earlier, moved faster, protected myself sooner. And the honest answer is, I made the decisions I made with the information I had and the hope I was carrying at the time, and the hope was not weakness. The hope was the natural result of loving a parent and wanting to believe that the love was mutual in a form that included your actual life. When I stopped extending that hope was not the moment I became strong. I was always strong. It was the moment I became clear. There is a difference, and it matters, and I want you to hear it because I think a lot of you have been mistaking clarity for something you had to earn over and over again, when really it was waiting for you the whole time in the form of the thing you already knew and had simply not yet allowed yourself to act on. I got to the building at 6:47 this morning. I always do. The parking spot still has my name on it in white paint. It has been there for 3 years and the paint is starting to fade at the edges, which I keep meaning to have refreshed, but I never quite get to it because every morning when I pull in and see it, even faded, it reads clearly enough. I walk through the lobby. I say good morning to the people I built this with. I say their names because I know their names, because I have always known their names, because that is the only way I have ever known how to run anything. I take the elevator to the 3rd floor. I open my office door. I sit down at my desk and I look at Austin through the window I chose for this building specifically, so that no one inside it would forget they were connected to something larger than the room they were sitting in. And I do the work. Not because I have something left to prove. Because this is what I built, and it is mine, and it is real, and on the morning that my father called to tell me it was being taken away, 5 people had already decided it wasn't going anywhere. That is what I come back to, on the mornings when the weight of all of it presses close. Not the confrontation. Not the 10 words. The 5 signatures. Written quietly, in a room with no windows to the floor below, by people who had watched me show up first every day for 7 years and had decided, without being asked, that they were not going to let that count for nothing. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.